Hello again, this is Dr. Herskowitz, and this week we're going to be looking at contracts. By far and away, probably one of the most important topics that we're going to cover in this class. So let's get started. A contract involves a promise or a commitment in exchange for something. It's a promise to do something or not to do something. So does that mean that all promises are legal contracts? Stop and think about it for a minute, and then answer true or false. No, not all promises are contracts, because there are certain conditions that must be met for a contract to be formed. As you read in the book, the primary condition is you have to have capacity and legality. There has to be an agreement that has to be supported by consideration. The agreement must have an offer and acceptance. So you have an offeror and an offeree. Sounds pretty straightforward and pretty simple, but it can take many, many hours of study and thousands of cases litigated on testing those various concepts. When you think of a contract, most people think of a formal written document, but it doesn't have to be. It is merely a promise of one person to perform or not perform, or a promise to pay somebody if somebody does something or if they don't do something. And it needs to be legally enforceable. The classification of contracts, they can be bilateral or unilateral. We'll talk about that in a minute. They can be express. Those are terms that are discussed between the parties, and they clearly understand what each side is getting into. And there are implied. Contracts are determined by the actions of the parties. And you can guess that the implied contract are the ones that have a lot of litigation, where somebody thought that something else was agreed to and it wasn't. So we're going to be primarily dealing with express contracts in this course. A bilateral contract is a promise for a promise. One person promises that I will pay you $5,000 if you will sell me your car. And the other person says, okay, I'll sell you your car, and I'll deliver it in 2 days. That's a promise for a promise. Then you have a promise for a action. That's a unilateral contract. There, a bilateral contract could be, I'll pay you $5 to mow my lawn if you come during the weekend. And the other person says, yes, I'll come on Saturday and mow your lawn. That's a promise for a promise. I promise to pay you, you promise to come and do the work. A unilateral contract is to say, I will pay you $5 when you mow the yard. So there's no promise to mow the yard. It's just a promise to pay when the action is actually done. So that is a unilateral contract. Contract enforcement. There are various types of provisions in a contract. One of the key ones is a forum selection. Contracts actually will provide, and many of you have seen them, that if there is legal action taken, if there's a lawsuit instigated, that it would take place in Oklahoma or Texas or wherever the parties agree. Now, when you're dealing with local businesses and you sign a contract and you both live in Oklahoma, that's pretty straightforward. But when you're doing national business or international business, or you're dealing with goods or services that are moving around the country, it's very important to select the forum where any litigation or any dispute will be resolved. And so there's the case of Carnival Cruise Lines v. Schutte, and Sony's going to be briefing that, so I won't talk about it now, but make sure you listen to her brief and respond with any questions or comments. Contract performance. There are two types of situations. When a contract has been formed, it has been executed. The promises have been finalized. I promised to pay you $5 if you mow the yard. You came and mowed the yard. I paid you the $5. That's an executed promise, a executed contract. An executory contract is where promises have not yet been performed. So the contract is ongoing. So the contract is not completed until both parties have done all their actions. You'll find this in real estate leases, month-to-month rental agreements. These are all executory contracts where one party has said, I will pay you the rent for the next 12 months each month, and the other party says, and I will let you live in the house that I own. And so those are executory contracts, leases, agreements that have not been completed by both parties. This is a very, very important distinction in bankruptcy. We'll be talking about bankruptcy later in the course, but there are special rules dealing with executory contracts in bankruptcy. Okay, you have a contract that has been formed, or at least it seems that it's been formed by having met the promise and the other conditions we'll talk about in a few minutes. But how do you enforce that contract? The court will uphold the validity if it's an enforceable contract. If it's valid, all the essential requirements have been met of an offer, acceptance, consideration, and capacity. So there is a valid contract, and the courts will enforce it. There are some types of contract that are void. They lack validity and enforceability. It's as if the contract was never formed. Neither party can assert that they want to enforce the contract. It is void, which means that it did not happen. And then you have another type of contract that is voidable. Void contracts, as we'll see, would be a contract to do an illegal act, something like that. Then you have a voidable contract, and this is where one party, the abused party, if you will, has the right to void the contract and say that there was never a contract formed. This is where there's fraud in the inducement, lying, cheating, stuff like that. And you'd say, well, wouldn't a person always want to void a contract? Don't know. And sometimes some very interesting things happen in the real world, and a person thinks they're defrauding a person, but it turns out that the action under the contract has more value than they thought, and the one party does not want to void it. But that's unusual. Usually the abused party will void the contract, but again, they don't have to. And so we'll be talking about what is a voidable contract. And then you have the contract that is a valid contract. All the conditions have been met of the offer, the acceptance, the consideration, capacity, but for some reason it's unenforceable. This is where the party has a legal reason for the court not to enforce the contract. One of the reasons would be statute of frauds. We'll be talking about that in Chapter 9, where certain contracts must be in writing. So even though you had a contract that the parties had agreed to, but they don't actually, they've agreed to it, but there's been a legal reason not to enforce it, for example, the statute of frauds, it wasn't in writing and it needed to be, then the court will step aside and say that they can't do anything. They will not enforce the contract. They will not take action any kind of a breach. Also, if you have your statute of limitations, there's certain times that contracts, actions, legal actions must be brought, and if that time period has passed, then nobody will, the courts will not enforce it. People have sat on their rights for too long. So that's just kind of a quick introduction to some of the key terms surrounding contracts. This week I'm actually going to have 2 videos for each Chapter 8 and 2 videos for Chapter 9. So I'll finish this now, post it, and then when you finish reading through this material, listen to my next video. Thanks very much. Bye.